Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Impact Measurement and Management, a COVID-19 Priority. We're really glad you're able to join us. A few house rules before we start. Your mics will be muted for the duration of the webinar to ensure that we can maximize video and call quality. We'll leave ample time for questions and answers, so we encourage you to use the chat function to send us your questions throughout today's discussion. And we encourage you to join us over video if you're comfortable with turning your camera on. We'll kick off today's session by turning the mic over to our moderator, Rehana Nathoo, founder and CEO of Spectrum Impact. Welcome, Rehana.
Hi, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our webinar. We're so thrilled that you're here. Deeply appreciate everyone making the time, especially with what feels like probably the 700th Zoom of your week. So thank you for being here. I'm particularly thrilled about today's conversation because I truly have nothing to bring to the table. I get to sit like you all do and learn from these three incredible impact measurement and management experts. And part of the reason why we wanted to feature this session pretty much midway through our series is that episodes 1 and 2, for those of you who have been with us for a little while, really set the scene for why impact investing is critical. But that conversation is really nothing without the measurement, management, and verification part of it. And so we're kind of thrilled to stop along the journey and talk a little bit about why IMM is important. For those of you that registered through Eventbrite, you've had ample time to, I'm sure, dig into the backgrounds of these incredible people. And so I think in the interest of time, given that we don't have too much for all of us to become IMM experts, we'll dig right in. I'm beyond thrilled to invite these three folks to join today and to share some of their expertise. We have Christina Leijonhufvud, who is a managing partner at Tideline and the CEO of its new verification business, which we'll hear a little bit about today. Karim Harji, who is a program director at the Oxford Impact Measurement Program, is also with us from Toronto, talking a little bit about his research. And then last but never least, Ellen Maginnis is here, who is an IMM consultant, and will have a lot to share about standard setting and the work that she does with clients. So we'll dig right in. A friendly reminder per Carmel's lovely intro that if you do have questions, we'd love for you to send them to us in the chat. They will come to all of the hosts and we will leave ample time to go over them. If we're getting a lot of great questions, we might skip right past what we wanted to talk about and answer them. So the format may change as we go, but we'll find out a little bit more about how that works. Just to level set, as we sort of have done with every episode, I wanted to just open with a definition of impact measurement and management just to set the stage. And then we'll go immediately into Christina, Ellen, and Karim's approaches. So the definition that we wanted to offer is the one that the GIN uses, and there's lots of different iterations of this, but for the sake of simplicity, we are talking about identifying and considering the positive and negative effects of one's business actions on people and the planet. And then the second part of this definition that we're talking about today is figuring out how to mitigate the negative effects and maximize the positive effects within the investment process. Christina, in our pre-panel prep, offered a much simpler, really easy way to think about this, and that is integrating impact considerations into all parts of the decision-making process, from due diligence to post-investment. And so we'll dig in a little bit on how that actually works in practice. But for those of you that are new to our work, want to be able to sort of level set with a definition. So I think we'll jump right in just to give us a sense of how broad this field is. My first question is really around how each of you approaches your IMM work. And maybe Ellen, we'll start right off the bat with you.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for having us. I'm really excited about this discussion. Yeah, the IMM work that I do largely fits in two buckets. The first is focused on IMM standards design, and the second is on the practical application of IMM practice. On the practical side, as an example, I have an ongoing role with Bolori Capital Partners, which is a private equity firm with an impact-focused GP stakes strategy, which means that they make investments into the top company of asset managers in the impact space. And I'm really excited. We've developed this framework it's awesome, and it assesses managers on their practices for incorporating social and environmental considerations throughout the investment process, like you touched on, as well as the impact performance that results. And as an added bonus, in addition to looking at sort of process and performance, it also looks at the diversity, inclusivity, and general culture of the manager themselves. So that's just an example of sort of the practical application side. In addition to enjoying getting in the weeds of things, I also am passionate about the role of impact standards and have had a number of roles related to that. 2 years ago, I helped develop the IFC operating principles for impact management, and I'm currently working with UNDP on the SDG impact standards, which I'm happy to dive into more details later.
Awesome. Yes, it's going to be, standards are going to be such a big part, I think, of our conversation today. So great to hear that. And we'll definitely be picking your brain. So thank you, Ellen. Karim, I'll go over to you.
Thanks, Rehana. And it's great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion. So just to situate my work, probably a little bit like Ellen, spent a lot of time thinking about how to design and do IMM with a range of both asset owners and managers, as well as occasionally with investees. But more recently through Oxford, trying to understand both through our executive education programs as well as research, how we think about what good practice looks like, the examples of choices we're making and how we move from these principles to practice, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about, and also to think about how this field is changing. 5 years ago, we maybe talked about measurement. Now we talk about management as well. There's a lot more activity, perhaps even noise. And so how do you navigate all these different acronyms, the frameworks, the tools? And so a lot of what we do is try and provide some sense of organization among those different ways of approaching IMM. In my own work, personally, use a range of tools and approaches, including some of the ones Ellen that has just mentioned. But I think also interestingly draw on my experience as an evaluator. So doing even classic and traditional program evaluation. So a lot of M&E approaches, which are being somewhat adapted to a market-based context, but also previously advising on impact investment strategy. So how do you bring a financial first lens on some of these things? And that raises a whole bunch of questions, choices, perhaps tensions that we'll, I guess, expect we'll get into a little bit later.
Awesome. Thank you. Christina, what about for you and specifically for the new verification focus that Tideline is taking on?
Well, first of all, Rehana, thank you again for organizing this today. We think this is such an important topic and timely one. Tideline, as a consulting firm in impact investing, has been advising on impact management strategies, tools, approaches, really for the last 6.5 years since we were founded. I think almost everything we've done as a consultant can be probably bucketed under the broad category of impact management advisory services, helping clients define their impact strategies and theses, and helping them operationalize those theses in terms of how they actually go about conducting impact due diligence, performance management, and reporting. More recently, we launched a verification business starting at the beginning of this year. We'd actually been working on the service for some time before that. It was really triggered by the announcement of the operating principles for impact management in April of 2019, to which there are now over 100 signatories. And of those 9 principles, the 9th is the requirement of independent verification. So we found many of our consulting clients started coming to us and saying, you need to help us figure out how to meet this requirement for verification of our impact management system.
Brilliant.
So we're coming at it from both angles.
That's awesome. And Christina, you're already hinting to quite a bit of evolution that I'm sure that the 3 of you have seen, but even for those of us that work more on the strategy side, just a very real and true evolution of how seriously people are thinking about this, and then where it shows up in the decision-making process. I think when we started our work even 2.5 years ago, impact measurement was an afterthought. And over the course of such a short period of time, we're starting to see it become part of the strategic plan, which is great to see and pretty fast progress. So a perfect time for Tideline to be doing what it's doing in a much more formalized way, in addition to what you've already been doing. Karim, you had referenced quite briefly the idea of this 5-year period being quite a period of evolution and growth. And I wanted, especially for the folks on the call that are a little bit new to the IMM space, I wanted to just take a moment to set the historical context of how far IMM has come. I mean, what is that evolution look like over the last 5 years? Karim, maybe you can expand a little bit on some of the great the great comments you were making around sort of from intention all the way to execution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to build on what you just said, I think for a long time, we use this intention word to describe what was distinctive about impact investing. I think we've moved past that. Perhaps intention still the core of the definition. We're now talking more about integration. And both Ellen and Christina, and their firms are doing a ton of work around this for different kinds of both asset owners and asset managers. So there's a lot to say around essentially still what is a work in progress of moving from intention to integration across the investment lifecycle, across different kinds of portfolios. And I think if we look forward perhaps a little bit, so maybe taking 5-year chunks 10 years ago when impact investing was kind of becoming a little bit more popular, but still very early days, intention was the proxy. Now we're talking about integration, and perhaps in the future, we're going to talk about integrity. And I think that's really a setup maybe for what Christina and Tideline are doing in terms of verification, because there are a lot of questions around what is enough. You're seeing so many more claims to impact from a whole range of different type of actors. And so intention is certainly not enough. Integration gets you, I think, a good way there. And then now we're talking about integrity, and some of the work that Ellen is working on, for example, around standards, are beginning to ask the hard questions around what does integrity look like for different kinds of claims. I would say one other shift, perhaps over the last 5 years in particular, we're just beginning to see this play out, is for a lot of the time we're talking about our intended positive effects. And so we measure the things that we think are good and what we want to do. And increasingly, as well as just in the last 3 months, we've been seeing that despite our good intentions and perhaps integration, there's lots of other things that happen that might be negative, that might be unintended, and perhaps that are risks to impact. And so we're beginning to talk about this, or have a language to talk about impact risk and negative impact, I think in a way that goes beyond classic ESG, but also in a way that we're still grappling with. And so perhaps we can spend a little bit more time on that, because in times of COVID, when we think about what vulnerability looks like, when we think about resilience looks like, some of the big questions, the structural questions around impact investing, it's not enough just to measure the positive intended effects.
I love this evolution towards integrity, and I would love for that to be a focus for us, particularly in such a resource-constrained environment. I had a thought while you were introducing yourself, and you were talking a lot about the evaluation work you've done to date, which has been incredibly comprehensive, particularly around North America, but around the globe. As you think about this evolution from intention, integration to integrity, for your work, where has evaluation come into it? Because that feels sort of separate, but maybe it shouldn't be.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, there's a lot of tools and approaches that are now being adapted and have been adapted to try and be clear about what it is you want to achieve. And now we talk about this in terms of impact goals. We do use tools like theory of change. So there's a nice intersection around being clear on your intent. I think a part of that is defining the scope of your influence. So what can you actually be held accountable for? Because then that has to tie into the integrity claim. Because a lot of groups perhaps are over-claiming, or maybe are pushing the boundaries of what perhaps a claim should be. I think the other big question is going to be who has the kind of right to make a claim around impact. And I think, as we'll talk about later on, there's a lot of work happening around process, and then there's an equal amount of work that probably still needs to happen around the actual outcomes and impacts on the ground. And that maybe story needs to be told a little bit differently than the process story. And again, it's not an either or, it's perhaps a sequencing question. And so I think from the global development perspective, from evaluation, there's a lot of techniques and tools around participatory evaluation, around thinking about whose voices matter, who does the auditing, who sets up the tools, et cetera. And I think we're still in the very early days in impact investing as a field and grappling with that. So we shouldn't discount 30 or 40 years of an equivalent experience in another domain, but also realize that this is a very different context when we talk about markets and competition and even questions of data, for example.
No, I really appreciate that. And your comment about whose voices matter feels incredibly salient right now, and a reminder just across the entire impact investing field, how much we've needed to grow and flex, but that we still sort of have this true north that we keep coming back to. Ellen, what about for you? How has this industry evolved over the last 5 years, particularly given some of the roles that you've had both in your consulting practice, but also formally within organizations?
Yeah. I think sort of building on what Karim had mentioned about the impact management project, which happy to explain sort of in more detail if useful, but 5 and 10 years ago, the sort of most significant way for talking about impact was to talk about the numbers of lives that were touched. And this was really like, you know, you'd see this splattered all over reports, and it always sort of felt a bit funny because, like, what does it mean to touch a life? It was sort of a strange phrase, but it was really common. And the IMP, the Impact Management Project, has been hugely helpful in articulating the multiple dimensions of impact. So with their 5 dimensions, we can now talk about who is being impacted, in what ways, for how long, the risk to sustaining that impact, and other sort of important aspects that are increasingly becoming standard when we measure impact. So I see that as like a huge trend and has permeated sort of all the work that I've done in the past few years. And yeah, I just wanted to emphasize too, like Karim's other point about negative impact, because again, like 5 and 10 years ago, their impact investors didn't necessarily focus at all on negative impact. They were really focused on the positive impact. And there was a whole separate world of ESG and a whole separate world of impact. And it's just within the past few years that that world is really starting to come together in really exciting ways. And so it's increasingly commonplace now that impact investors are looking at negative and unintended impacts in their portfolios, be that labor practices, emissions, waste, water. I think there's a lot more that we need to do in this space as a whole, and particularly impact investors that are really focused on positive impact. I've heard some impact investors sort of use the Hippocratic Oath terminology of first do no harm, and I really like that as a mantra. But yeah, a lot of my work in the past few years has really shifted a lot towards sort of developing integrated systems that look at the sort of holistic view of impact from positive, negative, intended, and unintended for multiple stakeholders.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned the IMP, because it's, I think one of the frameworks, as you mentioned, that we have that actually makes meaning of the practice of IMM. You so thoughtfully articulated the shift between negative externalities and unforeseen risk. Positive, sort of a positive impact, to a much more comprehensive way of thinking about externalities and risk. Do you see a connection between moving from positive to also negative, so much more holistic, and a move from measurement to meaning? Like, is there a connection there for you, or were they both going to evolve sort of independently, and it just so happens that we're talking about meaning while we're talking about comprehensive risk analysis?
Well, maybe answer that question in a more even more abstract way.
Please do.
I mean, I guess me personally, and for many others, the view and ultimate goal from my perspective is to get all investors to think about social and environmental impact into their considerations and into their investment process. And I think, again, things like COVID, rising inequality, climate change are making that sort of an imperative, both as it relates to returns, but also as it just relates to sort of, again, the broader systemic risks that we're facing as society. And so it's not a direct answer to your question, Rana, but I think, again, a noticeable shift in the industry is to sort of look at things holistically, and for people outside of impact investing to look at social and environmental impact. And I see that trend and the sort of merge between the worlds of ESG and the worlds of impact only continuing to grow in the next few years.
As is always the case when we get to dig into your brain, it's a better answer than the question that I asked. So thank you for that. Christina, it feels like, especially based on what Karim and Ellen have shared, and there's so much more that you could add to this, I know, verification feels like a particularly perfect practice for this moment in time. And I'm sure that's been true for a while. Can you talk a little bit about sort of over the evolution of IMM, why verification specifically is such an important part of the conversation, and would love some detail from you on how it's been going so far, because I know Tideline has been very busy.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rehana. And I have to say, I'm loving this conversation, and I just want to kind of have a dialogue with Karim and Ellen at this point, but I'll stick a little bit more to script. First of all, on the evolution, I think Karim put it so well. I really love that encapsulation of from intention to integration to integrity. I think that we are, what we're seeing is the field evolving from a singular focus on sort of the need to measure impact outputs, and as Ellen put it, a fairly simplistic view of what that means, number of lives touched, number of jobs created, to a much more holistic approach to, again, integrating, to use Karim's word, integrating impact into every part of the investment process in a way that really creates accountability on the part of the investor for operationalizing their stated impact intentions, so that they're carried forth in the way that investor is conducting due diligence, in the way they are conducting portfolio management, the way they're setting impact targets and expectations, and in the way they're measuring results. So measurement is obviously a part of that impact management framework. There have been a lot of standards mentioned. I just want to make note of the fact that while it can seem overwhelming, the alphabet soup of standards, I think the field has advanced tremendously over the last few years. And I would call out, in at least in Tideline's minds, I think probably some of the three most crucial standards that have been developed in the last few years. One is IRIS Plus, so the sort of next generation of the reporting and kind of metric selection standards in IRIS. The other is IMP that Ellen just did a nice job of summarizing, the Impact Management Project's 5 dimensions of impact. The market has really coalesced around that in terms of how to think about impact in a holistic way. And then again, the operating principles for impact management would be the third that I called out, which we really felt at Tideline was a watershed moment in the industry. It was, it's a very commonsensical yet comprehensive framework for thinking about all of the elements of impact in each stage of the impact investment process. So Tideline has been verifying the alignment of signatories to the operating principles for impact management. That is our first verification service. And so far we've completed 16 verifications, about 50% of the verifications completed to date in that market. In April, we published our first report that summarized sort of the aggregated anonymized findings from our first 13 verifications. And we've learned a lot from this process. I mean, what we're seeing is that the market has a ways to go on a number of fronts. While there's I think a lot of usage of IRIS Plus and IMP in the way strategic intent is articulated. The market is quite advanced on that front. There are still challenges, and I'll just name a few. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but one of the unique aspects of the OPIM framework, the operating principles, is it's bringing together this concept of measuring and managing negative impacts alongside the positive impacts. So something that both Ellen and Karim talked about. Also bringing together ESG risk and performance management together with impact management. That's fairly novel. And we see quite a dichotomy there in the market. Lots of players, even, pure play impact players who have just thought so deeply about impact, their impact intentions, the positive impacts they want to have in the world, but are still struggling with frameworks around how to manage impact risk, how to measure and manage ESG risk and performance in a comprehensive way. One other I'll mention is one of the principles around impact at exit. So how investors think about the effect of their exit from an investment on the sustainability of impact. That's a really tall order and really important one. That's what we all care about at the end of the day, right? We want the impact to live on. We want this to be sustainable. That's an area I think where investors are still figuring it out. How do they integrate those considerations into their exit processes in a way that is robust and disciplined and consistent?
Yeah. Really, really thoughtful limitations. Wondering if I can, particularly given what you share on the exit piece and how hard it is to sort of both quantify and qualify that into the process. So you mentioned that the first several verifications are around OPIM and that one of those principles is to submit to verification. So ostensibly the people that you're working with have made this commitment, but we know it's not that easy. Can you talk a little bit about just the disconnect between, okay, everyone agrees that we need to verify, but the actual process of verification is still difficult. It still requires consensus building and stakeholder engagement. How do you guys think about that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the service that we're bringing to the market is a little bit distinct, I think, from kind of a traditional audit function. So we bring kind of I think a sort of consultative frame in mind. We're looking to really add value. We're ultimately looking to advance practice. We want to help build accountability in the market, discipline, and ultimately comparability, so that investors and asset owners can actually benchmark themselves against peers, can understand how they're stacking up to best practice or to average practice. So in addition to sort of just helping clients comply with the verification requirement, we're offering, much more evaluative sort of product where we're going fairly deep, really analyzing the areas of strength, the areas for improvement. And when it comes to our OPIM verification, we're actually assigning a rating in terms of the degree of alignment to each of the principles. Something that, initially I think some clients find uncomfortable, and the rating's not required to be published. It's something that's really meant to provide that value add in terms of benchmarking. And I think most clients ultimately have found it quite a useful shorthand way of understanding where they need to focus their attention. And most of our clients really come to the table with a real willingness to learn and a real willingness to continue to improve their practices, which is what we all need in this market. We're all sort of learning together.
Yeah. It won't come as a surprise to any of you, but I used to love report card time in grade school, because it was a measure. It was a check of sort of your performance relative to others. And I think my poor mother, the ability to sort of engage in benchmarking without the punitive and or costly sort of side end effects of that, right? What is that going to mean from a capital deployment and raise perspective and all of that stuff? I could totally see a willingness to benchmark and just know if things are working. It's separate from, okay, what does it mean actually for the future of the business and the future of the fund? So it's actually quite great to hear, Christina, you talk about sort of an evolution even on comfortability around benchmarking, that it is a process like all things are, and people have to get comfortable with that process, and it'll make us better. So appreciate you calling that out. Thank you. I wanted to spend just a few moments before we talk about COVID, because I do want to make sure that we sort of connect the dots between why IMM is so timely. It always has been, but so timely now in such a resource constrained environment. But wanted to just spend a few moments digging in just a little bit more on the different ways that IMM manifests. Ellen, you had spoken earlier, you all had, but you made particular comment around the distinction between process and performance. And I was hoping that you could share a little bit about why that distinction is so critical, either in the work that you do or just broadly across the ecosystem.
Yeah, and it's very much related to what Christina said. The process versus performance is a really important distinction in how we look at IMM. And just to reiterate, the Tideline's verification to OPIM really looks at process, and so it's benchmarking against process, which is really needed. And so just again, trying to boil it down really simply, process is all about how a manager or entrepreneur goes about identifying, measuring, and managing social and environmental impact. And so that means looking at the practices around identifying negative impacts. It looks at the practices around setting goals and measuring against that. And those processes and practices are a necessary part and sort of foundation in order to have meaningful impact. Performance is all about the things that we can sort of tangibly measure in results. CO2 emissions, number of girls who graduated from high school, number of people with improved health outcomes. These are really quantifiable things that we often sort of think about and gravitate towards when we think about impact. And the industry has really evolved into this thinking about standardization and benchmarking in both the process and performance space. And I think the operating principles, and again, Tideline's sort of verification service against the principles is a really like value added look at process. And there are a whole bunch of initiatives, IRS Plus being one of them, that have really made huge strides in looking at sort of standardization around performance. So. Yeah. Both really important, both have made huge strides, both I think still like continue to evolve.
Yeah, right. I really appreciate you making that distinction. You know, one of the things that we struggle with as a firm, as exclusively a strategy firm, is that our clientele are mostly investors and allocators that are new to the impact investing field, and they have capital to deploy, and they have a very finance first approach to deploying that capital. And that's actually quite a good fit for us. That's where we want to focus. When we integrate a measurement conversation into the strategic design, which usually sounds like you need to measure, here are some things to measure. Okay, go talk to Christina, Ellen, or Karim when we're done. When we do that process, it's very much a performance driven process. We really struggle to have relatively new players, sizable players in the impact space, understand that process is equally important. And I could see why, and your definition of the distinction makes that very, very clear, right? Performance is what drives us. It's what brings a lot of people here. Can you talk a little bit about, at least in your work, how you link those things together? Because what I'm hearing you share is that they're both critically important, and yet I do think people that are new to IMM come for the performance. I mean, the process part is really this hairy, sticky thing that nobody really wants to deal with. And Christina, maybe at the end of Ellen's comments, you could jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, trying to keep it brief, I could talk about this for hours. But process is key to understanding performance. So without good process, it's really hard to understand what the performance means. And I think going back to Karim's sort of point of intention, integration, and integrity, process is like a key way of doing that. And it's really important from an LP perspective, from a GP perspective, and from an entrepreneur perspective. I think what I get really excited about in some of the roles that I've played, again, when people talk about impact, you want to see numbers, but the higher up the capital stack you go, the harder it is to get at numbers that are accurate and make sense. And again, going back to the whole number of lives touched, number of jobs created, there have been huge progress and strides in understanding the multiple dimensions of impact, but we're still a really long way from being able to like benchmark and compare on those multiple aspects. So even if you can get the number of farmers who worked in the supply chain, you know, and compare that between two investments, you're probably not going to get at the added income that they had, the duration of that income, and these other elements. And so in the absence of having really transparent, standardized data that exists for all investments, process is an amazing way to measure intentionality, integration, and integrity. And yeah, the operating principles are a great way at doing that. I mentioned the SDG impact standards, which are also sort of new to the market, but really provide standardization around some of those process elements.
I'll just pile on here a little bit. I mean, I think the way I think about it is very similar to Ellen. I see process and impact processes and impact performance as very much sort of a hand in glove kind of relationship. In other words, you almost really can't have, you will not get a holistic picture of impact or the accountability for impact without one of those. And so, you know, I think about it ultimately, sort of the North Star for us is ensuring integrity in what investors say is their intent, both that they are backing up what they say they're doing with evidence that they're doing that to achieve impact, and that they're backing up the impacts they say they're having or contributing to with, you know, some evidence that they're actually having or contributing to that impact. So it's sort of, you know, do what you say and say what you do. And so the process verification is really in many respects, I think, a foundation for the performance verification. Because when we are doing process verification, we're looking at, does this investor have a clear process for, articulating and identifying impact targets and metrics that are well aligned to their stated impact goals and strategy? Do they follow that up with their investees with a system for measuring and monitoring performance against those targeted impacts? If an investor is only asked to produce a report that tells you what number of jobs they've supported or how much greenhouse gas emissions they've avoided, without all of that sort of backup process, the process for having ex ante, due diligence their investees for the robustness of their practices, for the negative impacts, for the impact targets, holding them accountable, learning when impact underperforms expectations, then you really don't have much if you're just focusing on the ultimate sort of results of that investment or stated results of that investment. So what we're seeing amongst our clients is actually a demand for both. We're actually engaged right now in a couple of engagements to verify performance after having already verified processes. And that's being demanded by LPs and asset owners who want to know that in addition to sort of robust systems, that they can confidently rely on the impact reports and frankly replicate the reports in their own reports.
Yeah, in their own way. Right, exactly. Along this theme of education, Ellen and Christina, you both touch on the idea of actually bringing investors of all kinds sort of along in this process. Karim, you have decided to take on the extra responsibility of teaching around impact measurement and management, which just means that I think you're probably a better person than all of us, because it's hard to just do in our work. I can't imagine teaching on IMM, and the impact measurement program at Oxford really is, I think, what we have in terms of a best-in-class standard in distilling IMM sort of methodology and practice and realness into a classroom environment. I would love if you could share a little bit in that domain, in addition to your work, how have we evolved in the teaching of IMM, and is the work that you're doing at Oxford, do you see sort of benefits all the way down the capital stack? I mean, in a perfect world, these people go and work at these funds, but also what are the follow-on effects at the investor level?
Yeah, well, lots of questions. I'll try and at least provide some initial responses.
No pressure.
Yeah.
No pressure. We have hours. We're all going to be here all day. Yeah.
How do we change the business schools? We'll talk about that next webinar.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, one, it's a good sign that people are showing up and still show up. So we've been running this now for a few years. I also ran with Ani, who I see is on the call, program at Cape Town, and even there we've had a lot of interest. And this really came out of when I was teaching impact investing, both at Oxford and at Cape Town. We got asked so many questions around IMM. And even as we tried to expand, from a couple of hours in the week to a half day to a full day, it just wasn't enough. And so it was a good sign that there's lots of questions. There are even more questions now. And partly what we've tried to do through the program is to help people ask the right questions in the right order. And what that means, I think, for our teaching is, we use a couple of different frameworks. One, which maybe Carmel could send the RPA handbook that was just released. We use this framework of going from the why to the what to the how in that order, because it's just way too easy to jump straight into metrics. We now have hundreds of metrics. You just go to Iris Plus, you pick your metrics, you feel like, okay, those are things I should be measuring. I know how to count them. Everybody else is counting them the same way. I can compare and benchmark, etc. There might be an illusion that you're actually counting the right things. And once you count the right things, you can compare and you know what decisions to make. And in practice, maybe this is debatable, but at least what I've seen is that a lot of investors go straight to the metrics. They count a bunch of stuff. It takes time to collect data and to figure out what it means. But then they realize it wasn't as easy to compare for the things that they thought they needed to do. It doesn't really tell you the answers to the so what questions. You've collected all this information. Is it changing anything? Does it relate to your thesis? Are there other things you could have been doing? So a lot of the management questions, the impact management questions, won't get solved with just metrics alone. So you have to at least start by understanding why you're collecting data, help that inform what you actually collect before you get into the how questions. Interestingly, if we step back a little bit and look at this field, even in the last 3 to 5 years, we're in this really, I would guess, like a messy middle phase of field development. On one hand, we've decided let 1,000 flowers bloom. And so we've got all these tools and platforms, seemingly one every week that's coming out. So there's lots of choices. On the other hand, investors continue to say there's fragmentation, confusing language, noise, etc. And I think the amplification has been that you can collect a lot of data very quickly using technology. And so there's this parallel pressure of collecting a lot of data, not spending enough time to grapple with what really matters, and not really understanding how you manage to improve your impact or optimize your impact given what your inputs are. And so we've tried, as I say, to kind of ask the right questions in the right order. The other thing that's important, I think, for investors, but also everybody else to figure out around IMM is what are the things you want to prove, what are things you might want to improve, and what are things you might want to learn. And pretty much all of us, regardless of the kind of capital we're bringing, kind of enterprise we're running, have some combination of goals in each of these areas. And so metrics might be particularly helpful if you want to prove some things. To improve some things, you might need to look at more the lean data approach, et cetera. And to learn some things, you might need to look at what your peers are doing or how you might fund some collective research. And so sometimes all those things get piled on into one approach or methodology or tool. And it should be obvious that you can't achieve all those goals through one approach. So I think thinking about IMM as a toolkit, which is where we spend usually the week or the middle part of the week, is identifying your goals, kind of thinking about this as a toolkit, and then thinking about the decision-making implications of it.
So my takeaway is that anyone who wants to become an IMM expert just needs to enroll for this program as quickly as humanly possible. Hopefully we will soon be in a world where people can actually go to Oxford because it's beautiful and lovely. But what I really love, Karim, in all seriousness, what you shared, yet another Karimism that I think I will co-opt, is this sort of journey, this evolution between prove, improve, and learn. And it's the learning moment that's really resonating with me right now in the context of COVID. And we've actually had a few questions come in around COVID. So it's the perfect moment to segue just a touch. I think at least what we've seen in our work is that the squeeze of COVID hasn't necessarily unearthed new issues. It's simply amplified pretty broad systemic level breakdowns that we've been seeing for a while. I think probably everyone on this call was drawn to impact investing for one of the systemic issues that is now definitely being shone a light on to suggest that we don't actually have adequate systems in place to give everybody the quality of life that they deserve. And in a way, that means that we have an extra, I would say, burden, responsibility to make sure that capital is being deployed as thoughtfully as possible. And especially in the last 4 to 6 months, I've heard a lot of conversation around IMM as a way, in the spirit of prove, improve, and learn, of testing that. Is capital going to the right place? Any of the newer entities that we've worked with in the last, I'd say, 60 to 90 days are guiding us to build strategies with those COVID era issues in mind. And so there's this moment in time where I think we're starting to get very thoughtful about resource deployment, and we're trying to avoid impact washing. Karim, to your point earlier, do you guys agree with that sentiment that IMM is needed now? Is it just a convenient, is COVID just a vehicle to be making the same argument that the three of you and others have already been making, or do you actually believe that that now is the moment where we need to be focused? And I'll free for all. I'll just open it up to whoever wants to pop in.
Well, I mean, I do agree. Of course, you're speaking to the choir, but I put it in maybe a little more headline-friendly way. I think now is the time for integrity. Now is the time for accountability. We need trust in labeling. We need to rebuild trust in so many institutions that we live with. And it starts with rebuilding trust in our investment market. And again, in the impact and sustainable label. So I think we do need IMM more than ever in order to achieve that.
Yeah, I'll just chime in there. I completely agree. And I think COVID, climate change, growing inequality are really like all pointing us in the same direction, that we need to be able to integrate these social and environmental considerations into all types of investing. And IMM is that way to do that. I think, like, sort of slightly unrelated to COVID, but related to the SDGs, you know, there's PwC does a survey every year, and they found that like 75% of corporates have mentioned the SDGs in their report. And we know that we are not making significant progress towards those SDGs. And sort of touching on like the points that all of us have been highlighting, is IMM is not just about measurement. It's not about standardization. It's about a change in what it is that we're doing to improve positive impacts and reduce negative impacts. And I think COVID has only highlighted the need and importance to do that. And so, yeah, I hope that it gives us the additional momentum that we need, because it's really clear at this stage.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on that, you know, particularly when people are in more vulnerable positions now, thinking about the kind of positive, negative, reducing some of the negative, those become much more important. But I think it also helps us figure out, are we measuring the right things and at the right scale? And so on one hand, you know, we're seeing more impact investing activity, and that's positive. You know, we sometimes will need philanthropic capital and government funding to address some of these systemic issues. And so hopefully measurement can help us do a couple of things. On one hand, it can say, like, are we understanding how people who might be more vulnerable now, what are the right things to measure in the short term, but then equally think about the longer term implications of, are we creating systems that maybe are more resilient, perhaps even for the next, you know, second wave, but also thinking about what is that combination of measures that help us understand whether systems are more resilient, people are less vulnerable. And that involves a range of different types of data: subjective, objective, quantitative, qualitative. And I think one of the things we're grappling with, I think, in impact investing is, what is the role of impact capital relative to other capital? How does, for example, impact capital of different kinds, there's different flavors, react with or interact with philanthropic or public funding? When is the right time to be able to deploy certain kinds of capital, and what is the time frame for the impact itself? I think we all struggle with this issue when we're thinking about the return timeline financially versus the return on the social environmental side, and the fact that those often don't sync up, but that what it does require is combinations of capital rather than just one capital. And so there's obviously lots of implications for measurement. And I think one principle might be this idea of proportionality, because investors also have this question of who's going to pay for all of this, and who's going to do it. And so having your measurement be proportional to your goals, to the nature of the issues we're addressing, and then to think about who else needs to be involved in triangulating that information. These are things we're all basically learning as we go. And I think if we don't have a deliberate conversation around these kinds of topics at this level, it's going to be too easy to use a bunch of output proxy measures and then say, look at all the good we've done. And when people scratch below the surface, you'll get all these questions around impact washing, perhaps measuring the wrong kinds of things, and even worse, perpetuating the very systems that we're dealing with right now, that are allowing people to be vulnerable, et cetera. So I think measurement has a big role to play in a variety of different ways, and we shouldn't simplify it to a, let's look at what happened. It should help inform what we do next.
Yeah. I want to make sure, before somehow we're almost at the end of the hour, can't really believe that happened, but here we are. I do want to make sure we touch for just a moment on the issue of standards. We've gotten quite a few questions that have come in around the role that standards play in this conversation, and you've all very articulately weighed in on this over the course of your comments. But what do you think it takes to overcome the idea that impact measurement is this black box? Nobody really knows what goes into it, what comes down to it, and yet at the end of the day, we're all saying that we want standardized, comparable, benchmarked way of approaching the impact field. Just on this call alone, I'm thrilled to see folks from Gears, 60 Decibels, the SDG Impact folks, IMP, OPIM, Mercer, SASB. I mean, we've got such incredible brains working on the framework side of things and offering free, really thoughtful resources and dashboards for people that want to measure, but feels like a separate conversation from how do we all just get on the same page? And I would love to hear your insights on that, including if the answer should be we can't and we should not. Free for all again, because this is less work for me. whoever wants to jump in and say something, please do.
Go ahead, Ellen.
I was going to cop out with the answer. The standards conversation is really hard. There are a number of different standards that play a number of different roles, and I think there is space for all of that. Just because we only have a few minutes left, I guess, and just to highlight again, like an initiative that I think people should keep their eye on, the IMP, the Impact Management Project, has started an initiative called the IMP Structured Network, which is a group of like just about almost all the major standard setters, including the ones that we've all listed here, as well as GRI, SASB, and some of the other sort of broader, like less impact investing, but equally focused on social and environmental impact than we've been talking about here. And I think that group has come together because the world is really confused about the role that each of these play. And part of what they're trying to do is to create clarity on how this system functions together, which is no easy task, but they've made huge strides. And so it's definitely something that everyone should keep on their radar. So that's my sort of cop-out answer. But if anyone can summarize it better, please do.
No, thank you, Ellen.
And I think, there will be a need for numerous standards that the market coalesces around. I think we're beginning to see that happen already, but there's also a need for harmonization of standards. So I'm really encouraged by the IMP Structured Network and other efforts. We've seen SASB and GRI come together to kind of harmonize and compare their frameworks around materiality. So I think we're beginning to see some really intentional focus on harmonization of standards. We're also beginning to see some significant uptake amongst participants in the market of certain key standards. I mean, 85% of our clients are using IMP and IRIS Plus when it comes to impact measurement. I think, again, the operating principles I've talked about a lot. We have 100 plus signatories now to those. Obviously, UNDP is coming out with the SDG impact standards, which I think will be very helpful for those who are using the SDGs in their reporting. And I think, we perhaps don't need full regulation, but we need the market's acknowledgement or fear that that regulation is coming. And I think that exists. Mm-hmm. We clearly see a regulatory move in the EU, and we see the beginnings of that move in the US.
Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe the only thing I would add to that is, in our teaching, we push a little harder on, some of our assumptions behind standards, particularly around the decision-making kind of implications. So people want information that's packaged nicely, that perhaps is externally verified or comparable, but then you have to ask, how are they using that information, and what kind of decisions would they be making differently with, adherence to standards of certain kinds than otherwise would be the case. And so I think the thing we need to spend a lot more time on is, once we, as Christina, you just mentioned, we are moving into this place where a lot of investors are using standards of different kinds. There's some degree of convergence or overlap, arguably, between them. But the questions around governance and decision-making, I think we still have a long way to go. So that's maybe the next frontier of the intersection between IMM and governance in ways that maybe we don't do today, but it's perhaps a sequential process in field building.
Feels like we already have our webinar topic for this time next year. So everyone get ready for governance and decision-making in IMM on the 30th, 2021, wherever the heck we all are. I want to deeply, deeply thank Karim, Christina, and Ellen for all of this expertise, wisdom, and time. It's hard to have this conversation in any case, and to do so with a ton of candor and rigor is really a treat. So thank you to the three of you for being here. Thank you to all of you who have joined us, especially those that have been with us through the whole series. As we always do, we will make a recording of this session live on our site and make sure to email that to all of you next week. And encourage you to join us for the 4th episode at the end of August. Please feel free to get in touch with any of us with any questions that you have, and thank you for being here. Thanks, everyone.